Tonight, we're dimming the lights and sinking back into the softer, slightly shabbier cushions of European royal history. I invite you to let your phone rest on the nightstand, close your eyes if you like, and let me guide you through the extremely unglamorous afterlives of women who were once, for lack of a better word, professionally glamorous. Because sure, everyone knows about kings. They've got crowns, paintings, coins, castles, sometimes gout. Their mistresses, not so much. They usually ended up with less gold paint on the canvas and far fewer flattering nicknames. But their stories are weirdly fascinating, especially if you enjoy watching a little dynastic karma unfold in slow motion. And don't worry, I'll keep it relaxed. No sudden drama. Just the quiet hum of aristocratic disaster, perfect for drifting off to sleep. So, let's float into this candlelit corridor of history. Picture a woman in silk, carefully picked by a king, sometimes for beauty, sometimes because she laughed at his jokes, and sometimes because she was simply standing there. What happens when His Majesty inevitably eats too much roasted swan, or goes off to war and never comes back? Spoiler, it rarely ends with a happily ever after. The temporary glow of royal favor. First, let's set the stage. Being a royal mistress wasn't technically a job, but it functioned like one. You got free housing, lots of gifts, and possibly a little power if you played your cards right. Some mistresses even had titles created for them because, really, nothing screams this relationship is totally above board like giving your girlfriend a duchy. But there was always a catch. That glittery lifestyle was entirely dependent on the king still breathing. And kings, historically, were fragile creatures. They drank bad wine, went hunting in unsafe forests, and occasionally got murdered by their own cousins. So, when the royal heartbeat stopped, mistresses had to quickly figure out their next career move. Anne Boleyn. Before Anne Boleyn, let's start with an English case that's not Anne Boleyn, but kind of like her early prototype. We're going back to the 1400s, when King Edward IV of England, also known as Edward the Handsome because apparently cheekbones were his only real policy, had a mistress named Jane. Sure, Jane was considered the ultimate medieval beauty, tiny waist, sparkling eyes, and, according to the gossip, the personality of someone who could make a tax collector smile. That was her real superpower. Edward adored her, showered her with gifts, and let her hang around court as if she were a perfectly respectable lady. But then Edward went and died in 1483, inconveniently leaving Jane in the awkward position of mistress without a king. His brother Richard swooped in. Yes, that Richard, the one Shakespeare called a hunchbacked villain who probably did terrible things in a tower. Richard did not approve of Jane's cheerful presence at court. In fact, he accused her of sorcery, because apparently smiling and being charming was witchcraft if it wasn't directed at him. Jane ended up doing a little jail time, then some public humiliation, standing barefoot in London with a candle in her hand as people shouted things at her. Later, she married a man of much lower rank and faded into obscurity. In other words, from silk gowns to candle-holding street shame, all because her main sponsor decided to stop existing. French luxury and French problems. The French court, naturally, had a whole different vibe. French kings were basically professional mistress collectors. There were so many official mistresses, they actually coined the term maîtresse en titre, which sounds very classy until you realize it just means the main girlfriend. Take, for instance, Madame de Montespan. She was the official mistress of Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, who thought Versailles needed more gold leaf. Montespan was witty, glamorous, and very good at entertaining the king in ways that court etiquette books usually skip over. For a while, she was untouchable. Then came the king's next fascination, a younger woman with fewer enemies. Montespan was suddenly out. To add insult to injury, she was accused of dabbling in black magic and love potions, because, again, medieval Europe never saw a problem it couldn't blame on witchcraft. After Louis XIV grew tired of her, Montespan was exiled to a convent. Imagine going from Versailles banquets to convent porridge. And yes, she lived the rest of her life quietly praying. Because that's what fallen mistresses did in France, when retirement planning wasn't an option. The widow problem now, sometimes. A mistress was clever enough to pre-plan. That meant finding a husband before the king died. Of course, these husbands usually knew they were marrying the former favorite. But if she brought a royal pension or a few estates into the deal, most aristocrats pretended not to notice. One example was Nell Gwyn, mistress to King Charles II of England, the Merry Monarch. Nell was a former actress, famously witty, and possibly the only royal mistress who became genuinely popular with the public. After Charles died in 1685, Nell wasn't exactly rolling in jewels, but she had the foresight to secure property and money through Charles's gifts while he was still alive. She lived comfortably until her death, remembered not as a scandal but as sort of a lovable rogue. In the hierarchy of mistress retirements, Nell's story is about as good as it gets. The sadder tales, of course, not everyone was that lucky. Many mistresses ended up tossed aside, penniless, or pushed into marriages with dull men. Some were forced into nunneries, where they spent decades quietly regretting their life choices while chanting psalms. Others tried to keep influence by befriending the new king or, in a few cases, his sons. That could go spectacularly wrong. Royal families weren't exactly keen on reusing girlfriends, though history suggests a few mistresses did manage to recycle themselves from father to son, because dynasties, apparently, did not understand boundaries. Why? They rarely wrote memoirs now. You might be wondering, why don't we have more first-hand accounts from these women? Imagine the diaries they could have kept filled with gossip, the king's embarrassing habits, what kind of snoring he did. Sadly, most mistresses didn't leave memoirs because publishing how I spent 10 years as Henry's favorite wasn't exactly socially acceptable. A few letters survive, but mostly were left with court gossip, which was about as reliable as a 17th century tabloid. Still, their fates follow a pattern. While the king lived, they sparkled. When he didn't, they faded, often very quickly. It's like someone turned off the spotlight, and suddenly the glamorous woman was just another widow or convent resident. A quiet reflection. So, as you settle deeper into your pillow, consider this: history's kings thought they were immortal, and their mistresses sometimes thought the sparkle would last forever. But crowns rust, jewels get pawned, and convents always had spare beds waiting. And tonight, we've only skimmed the surface. Jane Shaw's candlelit humiliation, Montespan's exile to the convent, Nell Gwyn's lucky survival. There are many more to drift through, and we'll let their stories unfold in the slow, meandering way they deserve. Let's float gently onward. After the curtain falls, mistresses across Europe. So, where were we? Ah, yes. The spotlight dimming, the music fading, and the royal mistress suddenly realizing she was only special as long as her king kept breathing. We've already drifted past Jane Shaw's candle walk, Madame de Montespan's convent retreat, and Nell Gwyn's cheerful survival. But the story repeats across Europe, in slightly different costumes, with slightly different accents. Let's move sideways now, gently, like sliding across a ballroom floor in satin shoes. Tonight, we'll wander into Spain, Austria, and Russia because those royal courts had their own peculiar rules for mistresses, and their own creative ways of discarding them when the main attraction was gone. Spain, where religion complicated. Everything Spain has always had a reputation for being just a touch stricter than its neighbors when it came to morals, or, at least, appearances of morals. Kings still had mistresses. Of course, they did, but they tended to keep them less flashy, more discreet, sometimes tucked away behind layers of religious symbolism. Take King Philip IV of Spain. This man ruled during the 1600s, a period when Spain was technically mighty but financially bankrupt about 5 times a decade. He also had a mistress named Calderona, a stage actress. Yes, a Spanish king fell for a theatre girl because kings always seemed to find actresses irresistible, as if Shakespeare wrote the casting list for their romances. Calderona had a son by Philip, and for a while she lived the high life. But after Philip lost interest, she suddenly found herself in danger. The Spanish court didn't have the same tolerance for discarded mistresses as the French one. In fact, Calderona fled to a convent notice, the recurring theme here. She lived out her days in prayer. Her son, he ended up becoming a famous cardinal, which is ironic, considering his mother had been chased out of court for being too scandalous. So, in Spain, the afterlife of a mistress was often cloaked in rosaries and candle smoke. Once the king was done, the convent bell was waiting. Austria and the Habsburg Missand, then there were the Austrians. Oh, the Habsburgs, the family tree. That looked more like a tangled shoelace. Austrian rulers weren't exactly famous for their mistresses. They were more famous for marrying cousins, producing jawlines that could rival modern architecture and slowly collapsing under the weight of their own inbreeding. Still, a few mistresses managed to carve out space in Vienna's gloomy palaces. Take Empress Maria Theresa's court. Technically, she wasn't supposed to have mistresses since she was the female monarch, but her sons and her husband certainly dabbled. One of Joseph II's many rumored companions, for example, found herself politely ignored once Joseph grew tired of her. The Austrian version of discarding mistresses was less about drama and more about paperwork. You didn't get dragged through the mud. You just got quietly pensioned off. It was a different kind of humiliation. Instead of standing barefoot in public or being locked in a convent, you've got a nice little allowance and the silent judgment of Vienna's gossip circles. It was the polite version of erasure, which, honestly, might be worse. Russia, drama in fur cloaks, and then we reach Russia, where royal mistresses had it particularly strange. The Russian Tsars and Tsaриnas lived lives of almost theatrical intensity. Imagine palaces the size of small towns, golden domes, and an entire retinue of guards who never smiled. In this setting, mistresses could be surprisingly powerful, but when things went wrong, they went really wrong. Let's take Peter the Great, famous for dragging Russia into the modern age, forcing nobles to shave their beards, and generally acting like a slightly unhinged gym teacher. Peter had several mistresses, one of whom was particularly prominent. She was from a wealthy German merchant family, which made her acceptable enough for Peter to flaunt publicly. But when Peter grew tired of her, the breakup wasn't civil. He accused her of taking bribes, threw her family into disgrace, and basically destroyed her social standing. Anna's afterlife was bleak. She eventually married a different nobleman, But Peter continued to harass her from a distance, because apparently even Tsars struggled with letting go. Fast forward a little, and we meet Catherine the Great. Yes, she had lovers, plural, and lots of them. Unlike the typical king's mistress situation, Catherine reversed the gender dynamic. She kept a rotating cast of handsome young men, treated them well while they lasted, and then retired them with generous pensions, estates, and sometimes government jobs. One former lover even became a general. So in Russia, the fate of a royal mistress or lover depended heavily on who was ruling. With Peter, you might end up disgraced and ruined. With Catherine, you walked away with a nice estate and a cushy retirement plan. Honestly, if you had to choose, you'd want to be Catherine's ex. A little Italian detour before we drift too far. Let's stop briefly in Italy. The Italian courts, especially during the Renaissance, were basically soap operas. In marble palaces, mistresses weren't just tolerated, they were practically part of the furniture. Take the Medici family. Florence's ruling clan had so many mistresses it's hard to keep count. Some mistresses managed to climb the social ladder and secure marriages to lesser nobles. Others, well, let's just say they were quietly dismissed once the duke's attention wandered to a younger face. Italy had one unique twist. Though art, some mistresses ended up immortalized in paintings and sculptures. So while their real lives might have faded into obscurity, their faces lived on in oil paint, which is a mixed blessing. You get remembered forever, but mostly as that woman the Duke liked for 6 months. The emotional landscape at this point, you might be thinking, weren't these women devastated when the king died? And the answer is, sometimes, but many of them were practical. They knew from the start that their position was temporary. Some were calculating, using the affair to secure property or titles. Others were genuinely in love, which made the fall all the harder. And then there were the ones who simply adapted. After all, if you've lived at the center of power, even briefly, you learn how to navigate society's currents. A few mistresses turned into political advisors, salon hostesses, or even cultural patrons. They might not have had the title of queen, but they carved out influence in other ways. Still, the overall pattern remains. Once the royal heartbeat stopped, the mistress's candle flickered low. The glitter dimmed, and society was more than happy to remind her she had been just a mistress, no matter how powerful she once seemed. Floating forward, so as we drift further into this story, picture the slow procession of these women: Jane, Shaw, Madame de Montespan, Calderona Anna, monks each stepping down from their gilded stages into quieter, dimmer spaces. Some walked into convents, some into polite pensions, some into total disgrace. But they all remind us of one thing: royal favor was never permanent. Even the brightest jewel could be set aside in a drawer once the crown itself was gone. Let's keep floating. Ahead, there are even stranger examples. Mistresses who became queens, queens who started as mistresses, and the very rare few who managed to outlive their kings and still hold power. Because yes, against all odds, it did happen. Sometimes, when the mistress won anyway. So far, we've mostly seen mistresses shuffle off the stage with quiet humiliation. Bare feet, convent bells, awkward marriages to boring men. But every rule has an exception. And a few royal mistresses, a very few, actually managed to outlast their kings and come out on top. Not often, of course, because usually the queen's faction, the church, and about 17 different angry cousins were lined up to push them out. But sometimes, a mistress turned out to be too clever, too lucky, or just too stubborn to fade away. Let's drift through a few of these rare stories. Catherine Swynford. The patient upgrades will start in England again with Catherine Swynford. She began as the mistress of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, one of the most powerful men in medieval Europe. John already had a perfectly respectable wife, but that didn't stop him from falling for Catherine, who was originally employed. In his household, their relationship went on for years. Catherine had several children by him, children who were, technically speaking, illegitimate. Normally, that would have been the end of the story. Mistress has kids, Duke dies. Children live slightly awkward lives on the edge of noble society. But not here. John of Gaunt's legitimate wife died, and eventually, in a move that shocked polite society, he married Catherine. Just like that, she went from mistress to duchess. Even better, their children, the Beauforts, were legitimized. By royal decree, those same Beaufort descendants would eventually produce Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, which means the Tudors, those drama magnates of English history, partly owe their existence to a long-time mistress, who stuck around until the paperwork went her way. Not bad for a fallen woman. Madame de Maintenon, from governess to queen. In all but name next, let's float back over to France. Louis XIV, our son king with his golden shoes and endless fountains, had a long series of mistresses. Most of them flamed out eventually, banished to convents or given polite pensions. But one Francoise d'Aubigny, better known as Madame de Maintenon, took a very different path. She started as the governess for Louis's children, which is not usually the most glamorous job at Versailles. But she had patience, intelligence, and the ability to look unbothered while nobles bickered over curtains. Louis grew fond of her quiet steadiness, and over time, that fondness turned into something deeper. After his official mistress, Madame de Montespan, fell into scandal, Louis secretly married Meng. She never got the official title of queen because scandal, but in practice she was treated almost as his wife. And after Louis died, she didn't end up in disgrace. Instead, she retired peacefully to a convent she had founded, Saints, where she lived in comfort and dignity. So Maintenon basically beat the system. She outlasted Versailles gossip, secured her place at Louis's side, and ended up with a serene retirement. A rarity among royal mistresses, whose usual exit strategy was more humiliation than honor. Louise de Carouet, the pension plan meanwhile, back in England, there's Louise de Carouet. She was the French-born mistress of Charles II, the merry monarch with too many dogs, too many children, and too many mistresses to count. Louise wasn't popular with the English public. She was seen as a foreign spy, a Catholic plant, and generally that French woman stealing our king's attention. But Charles adored her. He gave her titles, money, and estates. When Charles died in 1685, most of his mistresses scrambled. Louise, however, had secured a massive pension from Louis XIV of France, who was delighted to have someone at the English court whispering French perspectives into the royal ear. After Charles's death, she quietly left England, settled back in France, and lived comfortably for decades. It wasn't glamorous, but it was secure, which, frankly, was the best-case scenario for most royal mistresses. Louise understood the assignment. Get the pension before the crown slips off. Barbara Palmer, the undying influence, and then there's Barbara Palmer, also known as Barbara Villiers, Duchess of Cleveland, another of Charles II's favorites. She was fiery, scandalous, and so unapologetic about her role that even when Charles died, she didn't exactly vanish. Instead, Barbara leaned on her position as the mother of several royal bastards. Children Charles acknowledged and provided for. Those kids gave her continuing influence at court, even after the king was gone. She lived out her life in a mixture of luxury and notoriety, constantly in and out of financial drama, but never fully erased. In other words, Barbara managed to make ex-mistress into a permanent lifestyle. Loud, messy, but still hanging around like the last guest at the party who refuses to leave. The exception that proved the rule of course for every Catherine Swynford or Madame de Maintenon who rose above it all. There were dozens of mistresses who ended in convents, poverty, or obscurity. Success stories were the exception, not the rule, but their existence shows that the line between mistress and queen was thinner than we sometimes think. A well-timed marriage, a secret ceremony, or a generous pension could turn what seemed like a doomed role into a surprisingly secure one, drifting toward the larger picture. So, what do we learn from all this? That royal mistresses lived precarious lives, perched on the edge of privilege and disaster. Some slipped quietly into shadow once their kings were gone. Some fought and schemed and managed to secure titles, wealth, or respect. And a rare few turned the entire game around, becoming founders of dynasties or secret wives of kings. As you sink further into your pillow, imagine them as candle flames in a drafty hall. Some blown out quickly, some flickering a little longer, and a few, improbably, burning steady until dawn. And that's where we'll leave part 3 next time. We'll drift into even stranger waters, mistresses who outlived their kings by decades, sometimes watching whole dynasties collapse around them while they quietly sipped tea in retirement. Because history, like sleep, always finds a way of looping back on itself. The long afterlives of mistresses. So, here's the thing. Not all mistresses disappeared the moment the crown stopped glittering. A few of them kept living, sometimes, for decades after their kings were gone. And that's where things get weirdly fascinating. Because a mistress without a king is like a theatre actor left standing on stage after the curtain falls. Do you bow? Do you leave? Or do you just hang around and pretend the show isn't over? Some of these women aged quietly into the background. Others lingered in the spotlight longer than anyone expected. And some, frankly, lived long enough to watch the entire dynasty crumble while they sat in their gardens, drinking tea, thinking, well, that escalated. Diane de Poitiers, aging gracefully while France moved on. Let's drift back to 16th century France. King Henry II of France had a famous mistress named Diane de Poitiers. She was older than him by about 20 years, which, in royal mistress math, is practically unheard of. But Henry adored her. She was elegant, poised, and probably the only person at court who could tell him to calm down without losing her head. When Henry died suddenly in a jousting accident in 1559, yes, a grown man still jousting at 40 because apparently nobody told him helmets existed, Diane's position collapsed overnight. Catherine de' Medici, Henry's widow and longtime rival, wasted no time. She basically evicted Diane from her luxurious chateau and snatched back all the jewels Henry had given her. But here's the twist. Diane didn't fade into misery. She retired gracefully to one of her lesser estates, lived a quiet country life, and continued to be admired for her beauty and dignity well into her 60s. She died in bed, peacefully, while Catherine de' Medici was still running around Europe, starting wars and making enemies. So in the great mistress-queen rivalry, Diane technically won by outliving the drama. Hortense Mancini, the mistress who became an itinerant celebrity then. There's Hortense Mancini. She wasn't just mistress to Charles II of England. She was also a kind of international adventuress. Born into a powerful Italian family, Hortense spent her youth bouncing around European courts, charming dukes and kings like it was a sport. When Charles II died, Hortense didn't lose her sparkle. She kept living in London, kept her reputation as a witty, eccentric hostess, and even ran a kind of proto-salon where people came to gossip, drink, and talk politics. She had affairs, she gambled, she dressed flamboyantly. In other words, she lived like a rock star in an age when women were mostly supposed to knit socks. By the time she died in 1699, Hortense was basically an institution. Not respectable, never that, but unforgettable. A mistress who turned her afterlife into an encore, Madame du Barry. When the revolution arrives and, then, of course, there's Madame du Barry. She was the last mistress of Louis XV of France. The king who managed to make being a monarch look both boring and corrupt at the same time. Du Barry was originally a working-class woman who climbed her way into Versailles through charm, wit, and probably a little help from fashion designers. She became Louis XV's official mistress, showered with diamonds, gowns, and palaces. But then Louis XV died in 1774, leaving her in an awkward position. His successor, Louis XVI, and his shiny new queen, Marie Antoinette, had no interest in keeping Du Barry around. She was politely shown the door and retreated to a country estate. That might have been the end of it. But then the French Revolution happened, and revolutionary mobs were not known for their gentle treatment of former aristocratic favorites. Madame du Barry tried to play it cool, even doing charity work to prove her usefulness. It didn't matter. In 1793, she was dragged to the guillotine, accused of being too close to the old regime. So her afterlife ended with a very literal ending. Not peaceful, not quiet, but undeniably dramatic. Which, to be fair, fit her Versailles lifestyle. The old mistress's club, it's worth noticing a pattern here. When mistresses lived long enough, they often ended up forming their own strange social category. Women who were once dazzling, now semi-retired, still whispering stories about the past. Some became eccentric old ladies in country houses where guests would come to drink tea and marvel at the portraits of them in their youth. Others clung to whatever bits of wealth they'd managed to keep, floating from one aristocratic salon to another like relics of a fading era. Occasionally, they even published memoirs, carefully edited, of course, to make themselves look witty, desirable, and slightly less scandalous than they actually were. If you've ever wondered why so many of those 18th century memoirs read like romantic novels, it's because the authors were trying to rebrand their youthful affairs as great love stories, instead of what they usually were, job contracts, with better dresses, outliving the crowning sometimes. A mistress's long afterlife meant she saw everything fall apart. Imagine being one of Louis XV's discarded favorites, sitting in your parlor during the French Revolution, watching pamphlets call for the heads of nobles you once dined with, or being one of Charles II's mistresses, living into the glorious Revolution when his brother James was chased out of England and replaced by a Dutchman with better accountants. These women, once so central to the private lives of kings, often ended their days as quiet spectators to history. No more jewels, no more banquets, just memories and maybe a slightly bitter laugh at how quickly the crown moved on, floating toward the end. So, as you sink deeper into your pillow, picture them. Diane de Poitiers, graceful in her country chateau. Hortense Mancini, still throwing parties long after Charles II was gone. Madame du Barry, tragically marching to the guillotine, her diamonds ripped away, each of them an echo of a time when being close to the king meant everything, and then, suddenly, meant nothing at all. Thereafter lives remind us that glamour fades, power slips, but sometimes dignity, or sheer stubbornness, carries you further than anyone expected. And with that thought, we'll leave part 4 ahead. In part 5, we'll drift into the weirdest, quirkiest details of mistresses' retirements, the petty lawsuits, the ridiculous fashion choices, and the surprising number of them who ended up raising chickens. Because yes, even a royal mistress eventually had to figure out what to do with her mornings once the banquet stopped. Mistresses, chickens, and lawsuits. By now we've seen the grand exits, the tragic guillotine endings, and the rare cases of graceful retirements. But most royal mistresses, their afterlives weren't glorious or dramatic. They were kind of awkward, because once the spotlight moved on, they had to invent entire new personalities for themselves. And that's where things get fun, because you'll see everything from petty lawsuits to bizarre hobbies to chickens. Yes, chickens. Apparently, when your king dies, farming suddenly becomes fashionable. Lawsuits, when mistresses' lawyer outlets start with lawsuits. You'd think these women, surrounded by palaces and pearls, would retire in peace. But no, some of them spent years in court, suing the king's heirs for pensions, properties, or even back pay for services rendered. Which, let's be honest, was exactly what it sounds like. A famous case happened in Spain. After King Philip IV died, one of his longtime mistresses, Maria Calderón, decided she deserved a little more than just memories. She filed petitions for her son, who, inconveniently, was also Philip's illegitimate child, to get recognition and money. The royal family's lawyers dragged their feet, of course. It was basically, thanks for your service, but please, stop knocking on the door now. Maria eventually gave up, retired into obscurity, and, rumor has it, ended up dabbling in a religious convent, which is a very on-brand pivot for a former royal mistress. One day you're dripping in jewels, the next you're crocheting Bible covers. The chicken strategy. Then there were the mistresses who just went rural, like truly rural. Imagine Versailles glittering with mirrors and chandeliers, and then picture one of Louis XIV's former mistresses sitting in a village chicken coop feeding hens. That actually happened. Catherine Charlotte de Gramont, one of Louis XIV's early flings, was once the toast of the French court. Glamorous, witty, adored. But after she fell out of favor, she retreated to the countryside and lived a quiet, increasingly rustic life. Accounts describe her doting on small gardens and livestock. She went from powdered wigs and satin gowns to muddy boots and egg baskets. It's a humbling image, and honestly, kind of sweet. Because while kings were busy starting wars, at least someone was making omelets. Religious conversions. Mistresses turned monks in skirts. Another classic retirement strategy, sudden bursts of piety. Many mistresses, after years of being called the scandal of the court, pulled a 180 and reinvented themselves as spiritual women. Take Louise de la Vallière, another mistress of Louis XIV. She had been with the king in her youth, bore him several children, and spent years basking in royal luxury. But when she aged out of his interest, harsh, but very on brand for Louis, She shocked everyone by joining a Carmelite convent. She lived out her days in prayer, fasting, and self-punishment, like she actually whipped herself as penance for her sinful past. So yes, royal mistresses could pivot from silks and banquets to itchy wool habits and daily confessionals. It's the 17th century equivalent of deleting your Instagram, going off-grid, and suddenly posting Bible quotes, gossip, memoirs, and petty social clubs. Some mistresses never fully let go of their courtly glory. Instead, they held on to their status by becoming professional storytellers of their own pasts. Madame de Montespan, the other famous mistress of Louis XIV, managed this trick. After she fell from favor, partly due to being implicated in a scandal involving black magic and poison casual, she lived comfortably on an estate. People visited her, and she would regale them with stories of life at Versailles. She basically became her own fan club. Others went further and published memoirs. Not all of them are honest. In fact, most read like historical fan fiction, where the author is always the cleverest, wittiest, and most desirable person in the room. But they worked. These memoirs turned mistresses into mini-celebrities long after the kings they served were buried. In a way, these women were influencers before Instagram existed. They knew their brand, and they weren't afraid to milk it. Mistresses as matchmakers. Here's another odd twist. Some retired mistresses became unofficial marriage brokers. Having spent years at the heart of court gossip, they knew everyone's secrets. They also knew which noble families were desperate for cash, and which ones had eligible heirs. So, widowed nobles or ambitious families would sometimes consult former mistresses to help arrange marriages. It's strange, but makes sense. Who better to navigate the messy politics of love, money, and status than someone who literally made a career out of it? Of course, this role wasn't exactly respectable. It was more like, we'll listen to you, but we won't invite you to church on Sunday. Still, it gave these women a place in society long after their royal job description had expired. The bittersweet fade to black. What's striking is how rarely these women kept their wealth or status intact. Even the most glamorous ended up sooner or later, aging out of power. Some got lucky. Diane de Poitiers, for example, retired in grace. Others got unlucky, Madame du Barry, with her guillotine ending. But the majority, they lived quiet, almost invisible lives. They gossiped, they gardened, they prayed too much. They wrote slightly exaggerated memoirs. They quarreled over money. And they quietly watched the world move on without them. For a group of women who once had the ear and everything else of kings, that slow fade must have been both peaceful and maddening. Imagine being remembered as the king's mistress forever, even decades after you'd stopped wearing diamonds and started wearing wool socks. Mistresses and their strange hobbies. One of the oddly charming things about these women is that, after years of courtly drama, they often filled their retirements with some very specific hobbies. And honestly, it's kind of delightful to imagine. Because what do you do after spending half your life as the center of a royal soap opera? Well, apparently you start collecting embalmed animals, sewing clothes for dolls, and overwatering your potted plants. It's basically the 18th century equivalent of binge-watching Netflix, just with more lace, taxidermy and pet museums. Let's start with the most eyebrow-raising pastime, embalmed pets. Madame du Barry, yes, the same du Barry, who later faced the guillotine, was known for her devotion to her little dogs. She pampered them with cushions, ribbons, and extravagant meals. After Louis XV died and her life lost its glitter, her obsession with her animals only grew. Reports claim she had some of her pets preserved after death, a sort of private doggy. Mausoleum, it sounds morbid, but it also makes sense. For a woman who had lived through so much instability, keeping her beloved pets forever, even in slightly creepy taxidermied form, was probably comforting. Imagine curling up by the fire with a stuffed spaniel staring blankly at you, cozy in its own unsettling way. The doll obsessions and mistresses redirected their energies into dolls. Yes, actual dolls. Anne Boleyn, technically not just a mistress, but, let's counter here, was said to have collected small figurines and dolls representing members of the Tudor court. Whether this is true or just propaganda is debatable, but the image is compelling. A disgraced royal mistress quietly rearranging her dollhouse while Henry VIII was out chopping heads. A few centuries later, Madame de Pompadour was rumored to have a thing for porcelain figurines. Whole cabinets of delicate little characters, posed in eternal grace. It was her way of curating a miniature. Perfect world when the real one was far too messy. So yes, grown women with palaces full of servants sometimes chose to spend their downtime playing with dolls, which, honestly, sounds relaxing. Gardening. Like too much gardening, the garden obsession was another theme. Louise de Querouaix, a mistress of Charles II of England, retired to a quiet estate after her royal fling days were over. There, she dedicated herself to flowers. Hours and hours of flower arranging, pruning, sketching her favorite plants, and writing dull little notes about the weather. Some of her letters survive, and they're basically, the roses are late this year. The tulips are lovely. The gardener sneezed. Riveting stuff, but also soothing. After the chaos of court life, roses and tulips don't argue with you, they just bloom. Collecting secret southern mistresses clung not to pets or plants, but to gossip. They basically became archives of whispered scandal. Madame de Montespan, for instance, loved to reminisce about her glory days with Louis XIV. Visitors to her estate were treated to marathon storytelling sessions. She would lean back, sigh dramatically, and recall who wore what dress, who fainted at which ball, who was secretly sleeping with whom. She was basically the 17th century version of someone running a tea-spilling YouTube channel. Except instead of subscribers, she had bored aristocrats sipping watered wine. Religious overcompensation. We can't forget the women who swung hard in the other direction, trading lace for hair shirts. We touched on Louise de la Vallière already, but she wasn't the only one. Some retired mistresses took up obsessive religious practices, were talking fasting until fainting, endless prayer vigils, and keeping skulls on their desks as memento. Maury decorations. It was the equivalent of trying to delete your browser history. Except your browser history was 20 years of scandalous love affairs with a monarch. And while this might sound grim, it also gave these women a sense of purpose. You can only water flowers for so long before you start wondering if God is still keeping score. Artistic phases. Some mistresses dabbled in the arts. Madame de Pompadour, again, stands out here. She wasn't content to just sit around looking pretty. She painted, designed porcelain pieces, and even performed in little plays. In her later years, when she had less royal attention, these hobbies kept her busy and gave her something resembling dignity. She even supported the building of the Sèvres porcelain factory, which still exists today. So the next time you see some overpriced French porcelain at an antique shop, You can thank a royal mistress who got bored one afternoon. Quiet wealth and chess games. Then there were those who just lived quietly rich. They played cards, they sipped chocolate, they hosted the occasional salon. In some ways, this was the happiest ending of all. No guillotines, no chickens, no convents, just a slow, cushioned fade into irrelevance. It wasn't glamorous, but it also wasn't humiliating, like Diane de Poitiers, who outlived her lover King Henry II by decades. She managed her estates with sharp efficiency, hunted in the countryside, and continued dressing in flattering black and white outfits well into old age. She even kept riding horses in her 70s. It wasn't scandalous or tragic. It was just steady. The thread that ties them together, what all these hobbies show is how human these women were once stripped of their royal sparkle. Some turned to animals, some turned to flowers, some turned to dolls, some to God, some to gossip, and a rare few turned their side hustle into an actual lasting legacy. But beneath it all was the same quiet truth. They had to fill the silence. Somehow, after years of jewels, whispers, and power games, they were left with themselves. And that's when you see the real person peek through. Sometimes eccentric, sometimes pitiable, sometimes surprisingly admirable. The children of royal mistresses. When kings kept mistresses, they didn't just keep them for the conversation. Inevitably, there were children, dozens of them, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes hidden, sometimes raised as though they were half royal, half forbidden curiosities. And after the king died, these children often faced the strangest tightrope act imaginable. They weren't heirs, unless you count the odd, scandalous case, but they weren't nobodies either. They lived in this awkward limbo where their bloodline gave them status, but their mother's reputation dragged them down. Let's tuck in and drift through some of the more curious examples. The lucky few, when bastards became dukesome royal. Bastards actually landed on their feet. Charles II of England, for example, had no legitimate children with his poor, sidelined wife, Catherine of Braganza, but with his mistresses. Oh, he was practically a factory. At least a dozen illegitimate children were scattered across his various affairs, and Charles, being a rather pragmatic sort, just went ahead and acknowledged them. He handed out dukedoms like party favours: Duke of Monmouth, Duke of Grafton, Duke of St. Albans, Duke of Richmond. You get a duke title, you get a duke title. Everybody gets a duke title. The irony, of course, is that none of them could inherit the throne. They had all the perks of rank and wealth, but none of the ultimate power, which, to be fair, is not a terrible deal. You get the fancy name and the estate, but you don't have to worry about Parliament chopping your head off if things go south. Well, unless you're James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, who decided to rebel and did end up executed. But hey, not everyone reads the fine print on being royalish. The sad middle ground, half in, half out, children of mistresses were left in a murkier position. Take Louis XIV's illegitimate brood. With his mistresses, particularly Madame de Montespan, he produced a small army of kids. Unlike Charles II, Louis didn't rush to parade them all through court. He kept things quieter. Some were raised in carefully managed households. Their status whispered about, but not officially trumpeted. Eventually, he did legitimize several of them, giving them noble titles and advantageous marriages. But of course, this stirred resentment among the real aristocracy, who weren't thrilled about competing with the king's love children for prestige. Nothing says awkward dinner party like your noble cousin being a bastard who just got handed a dukedom For the children themselves, this meant a life of constant balancing. They weren't quite royal, but they weren't quite not royal either. Always hovering in between, their fortunes shifting with their father's mood. And after Louis died, their position became even shakier. New monarch, new priorities, less tolerance for yesterday's dalliances. Suddenly those glittering titles could turn into heavy burdens. The quietly forgotten ones, then there were the children who weren't acknowledged at all. Some mistresses gave birth in near secrecy. Their children farmed out to distant convents, foster homes, or rural estates. Madame du Barry, for example, probably had no children with Louis XV, but some of his other mistresses certainly did. Many of those children grew up without much record, their names fading into obscurity. They had royal blood in their veins, but no one wanted to mention it. It was an odd kind of invisibility. You existed, people whispered about you, but your life path was deliberately smoothed out of the official story. You were a footnote, erased before you could even begin. The pressure to marry well for the acknowledged daughters of mistresses. The goal was usually a respectable marriage, preferably to someone with a title but without too much ambition. Catherine, Charlotte de Gramont, daughter of a mistress of Louis XIV, was married off in this way. These unions were less about romance and more about managing the awkwardness of illegitimacy. Marry her off, fold her into the noble class, and hope everyone forgets the exact circumstances of her birth. Of course, the daughters often carried the same burden as their mothers: whispered rumors, sideways glances, and the sense that no matter how glittering their wedding, they weren't fully in. It was like being perpetually at the kids' table at the banquet of history, a different kind of inheritance. One of the more fascinating parts of this story is how mistresses' children sometimes inherited their mother's eccentricities more than their father's crowns. Take Hortense Mancini, mistress of Charles II. Her children grew up in the shadow of her scandalous adventures, not their father's royal name. She was wild, glamorous, perpetually dramatic. Her children absorbed that sense of chaos, their lives marked more by her personality than by any whisper of royal blood. In other words, being the child of a mistress didn't guarantee stability. Sometimes it meant you inherited the court drama gene instead. When it got truly complicated occasionally, these children tangled directly with politics. The Duke of Monmouth, as we mentioned, is the classic case. Illegitimate son of Charles II, who decided he should just go ahead and claim the English throne. Spoiler, bad idea. But the allure of royal blood was irresistible. Even without legal claim, some of these kids couldn't help but believe they deserved more. And honestly, who could blame them? Imagine growing up in a palace, surrounded by wealth and attention, but being told at the same time, oh, but not that kind of royal. Don't get ideas. It was a recipe for discontent, and occasionally rebellion. The emotional side, beyond politics and titles, there's the quieter, sadder angle. Many of these children grew up knowing their mothers were mocked, their fathers married to someone else, and their own existence a kind of embarrassment. Some must have felt deep insecurity. Others probably leaned into entitlement. Most were trapped in between, raised in privilege, but never quite belonging. It's the strange paradox of being both elevated and diminished at once, like standing on a pedestal that's sinking into quicksand. Reputation, memory, and the afterlife of royal mistresses. The thing about being a royal mistress is that you don't get to write your own ending. Not really. You live in the king's shadow while he's alive, And after he's gone, you live in the shadow of what people say you were. Sometimes you're remembered as glamorous, sometimes as wicked, sometimes as both at once, depending on who's telling the story. And because historians, pamphleteers, and bitter aristocrats all loved a juicy tale, the post-mortem reputation of Mistresses is often a messy collage of fact, rumor, and exaggeration. The saintly conversions, one of the easiest ways for a mistress to clean up her image after her royal lover's death was to suddenly discover religion. We've already seen examples, Madame de Maintenon quietly turning into a Catholic matron, Louise de la Vallière slipping into a convent habit. There's something almost theatrical about it. The same woman who spent her youth dancing through candlelit corridors now renounces all earthly pleasures and shuffles off to a cloister. And society loved this narrative. It was neat, redemptive, easy to digest. People could sigh and say, yes, she sinned, but she repented. Of course, whether these conversions were heartfelt or just convenient PR stunts is another matter. Maybe they truly did feel guilty. Maybe they just wanted to make sure they weren't remembered as frivolous sinners. In either case, their reputations often ended on a softer note than they might have otherwise. The wicked legends, not every mistress, got such a tidy wrap-up. Some were immortalized in gossip as conniving harpies, remembered less for who they really were, and more for how much they irritated the court. Take Madame de Pompadour. Even though she outlived Louis XV and spent much of her later life as more of a companion than a lover, critics loved to paint her as a manipulative schemer. She was accused of everything from bankrupting France to personally causing bad weather, which, if true, would make her a far more powerful sorceress than politician. Her reputation, even centuries later, carries this faint whiff of scandal, as though she were the puppet master behind the curtain of Versailles. Never mind that most of that was paranoia and misogyny. The legend stuck, the gentle nostalgia sometimes. With enough time, people soften toward mistresses. They become romantic figures, remembered with a hazy glow of nostalgia. Think of Nell Gwynn, Charles II's actress mistress. She died relatively young, but her image lingered as a cheerful, witty, harmless sort of mistress. The one who joked about being the Protestant whore, who made the king laugh, who never took herself too seriously. By the Victorian era, Nell was practically a folk heroine. Portraits of her circulated with sentimental captions. Never mind the messy realities, she had been rebranded as the nice mistress, the one you could smile about without feeling guilty. The convenient scapegoats of the mistresses were used as scapegoats for bigger political problems. When monarchies collapsed, mistresses often made convenient symbols of decadence and waste. Marie Antoinette's actual political failures were plenty, but pamphleteers also dragged in every woman who had shared Louis XV's bed, painting a picture of centuries of corrupt, spendthrift women draining France's lifeblood. It was unfair, of course, but effective. Mistresses were easy to caricature. Extravagant gowns, jewels, and perfume bottles were far more vivid symbols of monarchy's excess than tax codes or grain shortages. And so, in the popular imagination, mistresses became shorthand for everything that had gone wrong. Historians at work by the 19th and 20th centuries, historians started picking apart these reputations. Some mistresses were re-evaluated as savvy political players. Others were reframed as victims of circumstance. For example, Madame du Barry was long remembered as a shallow courtesan. But modern historians point out that she actually wielded influence in foreign policy, acted as a patron of the arts, and tried to intervene mercifully during the revolution. It doesn't erase the gossip, but it complicates it. History has a funny way of sanding down the sharp edges. Mistresses who were once infamous become quaint, even fascinating. They shift from scandalous contemporaries into safe, historical curiosities. Their own attempts at legacy and, let's not forget, some mistresses actively tried to shape how they'd be remembered. They wrote memoirs, commissioned flattering portraits, and donated money to charitable causes. Madame de Sévigné, though not technically a mistress, chronicled Versailles life in letters that shaped how people remembered the personalities of court. Meanwhile, someone like Hortense Mancini carefully framed herself in memoirs as adventurous, bold, and misunderstood, a spin that still influences how we talk about her today. It's almost as if they knew their reputations would outlive them, and they wanted to leave breadcrumbs for the future. The final irony at the end of the day. The afterlife of a royal mistress's reputation depended less on who she really was and more on what story people wanted to tell. Need a repentant sinner. Cue the convent narrative. Need a scapegoat for political collapse. Cue the wicked schemer, TROPE. Need a touch of romance and nostalgia. Cue the charming actress with the heart of gold. The real women often disappear under all that storytelling, which is, in a way, the ultimate irony. Women whose whole lives revolved around the king's attention continued to be defined not by themselves, but by what others said about them. Even in death, they were never fully their own.